Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us for our Equal Justice Forum, Democracy at its Crossroads. My name is Elias Eli Valentin II, and I have the distinct honor of serving as chairman of the Greenville County Democratic Party. Located in the upstate of South Carolina, the GCDP is finding creative ways to engage with our community during this pandemic. Our fundraising team, who has worked tirelessly to put this event on, is helping us bring conversations to you that are vital at this moment in our nation's history. They're providing the infrastructure so that we can continue to grow as a local party and continue to thrive in the new South and the Democratic Party that will shine in it. Our precinct development committee is creating new relationships and reaching out to voters in a myriad of ways to motivate them throughout this October and November voting season. Our communications department is putting out amazing and necessary content, messaging that will hold our current leadership in both the county council and in our state legislature, both the state Senate and the state House, and hold them accountable for the choices and the policies that they've been implementing while they've been in control. As we think about what our world will look like after this election, it's so important to take a step back and realize how we've gotten. Our amazing fundraising coordinator, Regina Waldrop, shared an article with me, and it was so powerful. And it talked about Susan Sandler, who is a liberal philanthropist. And unfortunately, she got a diagnosis of brain cancer. It's very rare. And she unveiled a really unique effort via Medium on a post announcing $200 million investing in racial justice organizations all over the South and the Southwest, especially those that are experiencing rapid demographic and transformational change. In this New York Times article that I read, there are two quotes that just stuck out to me that are so important and poignant while we have this conversation. And Ms. Sandler states, "I have come to believe that rather than trying to use persuasive papers and reports to attempt to change the minds of those who are making decisions, the more effective way to transform societal priorities and public policies is to change the climate and environment in which decisions are made." She goes on to also say, "In ways big and small, each of us can establish a legacy." She writes she's grateful that she'd been given time since her cancer diagnosis to establish her own. And she urges each of us in this article and in her piece to not wait to work on establishing what our legacy will be like. There are days where it is hard to be a county party chair. This is not one of them. I have been waiting for this event because we just have such an esteemed panel of scholars and thinkers and movers and shakers, but more importantly, we have a moderator who has lived this experience, but has done it in a way that has showcased his integrity, his empathy, and his heart. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to start by thanking our leadership team and your leadership team here locally in Greenville. Our first vice chair, Ruth Todd, our second vice chair, Sharon Garrett, and our third vice chair, Jonathan Sweeney. I want to welcome all of you to our forum tonight. And I hope you all create a legacy. And if that legacy is the GCDP, please feel free to donate via our Act Blue. You can find our investment button on our website. Grow the party with us. I ask that you join us in this movement. And now I have the distinct honor of introducing someone who is very, very special to our local party, but also special to the United States and the rule of law. Ricardo Urbina is someone who has been around and has helped this party in ways known and unknown. But one of the things that is most special to me was reading a piece in the Washington Post about Ricardo. Ricardo studied Aikido in his 50s. He meditated daily, but he also had an understanding that with law has to come some understanding of where people are coming from, the problems that people face. And we currently don't see that in our Attorney General or in the way that our Justice Department is run. Ricardo Urbina served as a US District Judge and has been not only a leader in the Constitution and upholding the Constitution, but has been a model for young lawyers and judges as well as his colleagues. He also has the distinct pleasure of being married to the wonderful Corrine, who, if you all know her, just lights up a room when she walks in. I cannot do any more justice to introduce the wonderful Judge Ricardo Urbina, but we are so grateful for him moderating this conversation, for being engaged with our local party, and always bringing the truth in his speech and in the conversation he has to elevate the law and bring it back to where it deserves. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our moderator, Ricardo Urbina.
Eli, thank you. Thank you very much for your very gracious and warm introduction. I only hope that I can continue to live up to some of the principles that you all envision that I embrace. So that I won't scandalize anyone by the fact that I'm a federal judge who's speaking on political issues, let me say that I am retired, and during my 31 years on the bench, I never engaged any kind of political discussion or dialogue because it was forbidden by the rules of ethics. And although I retained the title as a federal judge because I was appointed under Article 3 of the Constitution, once I've retired, now I am free to express my views pursuant to the Constitution and to my rights as a citizen. And that's what I hope to do tonight as I navigate this discussion that is so important to all of us, especially now as we approach the election. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us and accepting the invitation to the Greenville County Democratic Party, that this first of a series of forums and discussions examining social and legal issues of importance to our community. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this program, Regina Walthrop being among them, and all the other persons who have worked so tirelessly to structure this event at a time when we seek to improve our understanding of issues which may influence our choices on Election Day. A Washington Post article captioned "Warning Signs for the State of Democracy," authored by Michael Miller, cites several warning signs, red flags, emerging in American communities, which threaten the survival of our democracy, our constitutional protections, and life as we know it. Some examples cited are lack of effective constraints of executive power against the abuses of power, and lack of respect for the judicial, legislature, and the rule of law. Inflammatory rhetoric that aims to corrode the values and institutions that we hold dear and which have guided this country from the outset. Undermining elections, curtailing civil liberties, the threat of or the use of force for political gain, attacks on the media, and the spread of misinformation. This is a collection of thoughts and ideas. This is a collection of conduct, acts that we become acquainted with, but which we dare not become used to, because without a reaction to what is wrong, we are doing the wrongdoing ourselves. In that vein, I'm honored to preside over this panel discussion launched by some truly distinguished members of our legal community who come prepared this evening to improve our understanding of how democracy, the Constitution, and our way of life have, in view of many, come under siege under the current administration. First is Frank Holleman. Although I haven't spent much time with Frank, I have come to know him through his reputation and what people have said about him over the course of time. He has quite a distinguished career, and many people do. I mean, I've moved here from Washington, D.C. to find that there is a thriving and brilliant legal community here that is aimed at doing the right thing at the right time. Frank is a distinguished Harvard Law School graduate. He served as a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun and practiced law at the premier law firm of Weich, Burgess, Freeman, and Parr in Greenville. But taking even a closer look reveals that Frank's roots in South Carolina politics runs long and deep. He served as Greenville's Democratic Party leader from 1988 to 1990. One of the hallmarks of Frank's career is government service. In 1994, President Clinton appointed him to serve as Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and in 1999, the president selected him as the United States Deputy Secretary of Education. Frank is currently the senior litigating attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center, and we are thankful for his presence and his participation in this event. His energy, vision, and intellectual acumen have fueled his unceasing dedication to protecting our government. And what's interesting to me as well is that people in the law here in Greenville and elsewhere take on a special role that is suited to the perception, the vision that they have. For example, Frank is learned and active in issues and problems that relate to the environment. He goes out to toxic waste sites and examines and works alongside with others who are trying to determine the extent of damage that's been done by some toxic event. And he will this evening examine for us the links which connect environmental issues to people's health and how the downgrading of environmental protections affect racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups, rendered particularly vulnerable as a result of unhealthy water and air and where those individuals happen to live. We also have with us Professor Teresa Nesbitt. Now, Professor Teresa Nesbitt Cosby is a graduate of both Howard University undergraduate and law school. And when I learned that, I was tempted to see if perhaps I had been one of her teachers, since I taught at Howard Law School for almost 8 years. But then I realized, as I did a little research, that she was probably in grammar school when I was teaching at Howard. So I dare not venture into that. But currently, Professor Nesbitt Cosby is an associate professor of political science at Furman University, and her specialty is constitutional law and racial and ethnic politics. Among her many notable achievements are her years as a law clerk to United States Magistrate Judge William Cato, Jr. She was an assistant deputy attorney general for the South Carolina Attorney General's office. She was an executive director of legal services of South Carolina and an executive director of the Black Family Land Trust. Incidentally, if you tuned into Straight Talk, the series at Furman University, you may have seen her, as she was the moderator of a program there captioned Democracy at Risk. We are very fortunate that Professor Cosby Nesbitt has joined us this evening, or Nesbitt Cosby, excuse me, have joined us this evening to shed light on how racism is a major contributor to our fractured system of justice and erosion of our governmental institutions and protections. The third panel member that will join us this evening is Shaundra Young Scott. Ms. Scott is a native of North Charleston. She received a BA from the University of South Carolina and her law degree from John Marshall Law School in Atlanta. After studying Spanish in Puerto Rico and Mexico, she applied her bilingual skills when she served as supervising attorney with South Carolina Legal Services Migrant Farm Worker Division. This issue of dealing with immigrants and finding rights that they should be that should be observed in their behalf is special to me. And my mother came to this country from Puerto Rico, and my father came to this country from Honduras. And I am personally acquainted with some of the problems that persons from other countries, as Latin America included, encounter when trying to deal with the culture and with the limitations that are imposed on persons who don't speak the language as well as American-born, as United States American-born. Now, Ms. Young also has held the position of Executive Director of the ACLU, South Carolina, as well as Deputy Political Director of the Kamala Harris 220 presidential campaign. You may recall that she ran for president. Ms. Scott has a reputation as a warrior. And again, I've been able to scout around and listen to people talk about these three individuals, and I'm just extraordinarily proud to observe that she is considered to be relentless, unyielding, and courageous. As a director of voter protection with South Carolina Democratic Party, she daily battles to ensure that every citizen in our state is free to exercise the right to vote. Isn't this an issue that's important nowadays? Always important, but especially now, it would seem. This evening, she will discuss her work on the front lines to safeguard voter protections and mobilize every resource to register South Carolina voters and to get them to the polls. That is the introduction I would serve you with as we approach the point where these panel members will now discuss their specific topics and areas of expertise. All right, perhaps we should start with, yes. Frank, would you mind starting us off here and talking about the subject matter that you're here to discuss with us?
Sure. Yes. I hope you all can hear me. Thank you very much for having me. And let me start with a disclaimer like Ricardo. Of course, I'm not a judge, but I do work with one nonprofit full-time, one environmental nonprofit full-time, and volunteer as the president of another. And of course, those are strictly nonpartisan organizations. So what I blame what I say tonight on me alone. In particular, I want to emphasize tonight the issues of environmental justice. We have had in the last 4 years the most coordinated assault on our environmental protections that have been put in place really by both parties, but in more recent years, particularly by leaders elected from the Democratic Party, to protect our environment at every level, whether it's climate change, whether it's toxic chemicals, protecting our clean air and our clean water, wildlife, access to recreation, whatever it may be. You know, the Bible says the rain falls on everyone. So everyone is impacted by pollution and everyone is helped by environmental protection, but the effects are particularly great on anyone who is in any way disadvantaged. Whether it's due to income, health, age, ethnicity, where a person lives, or their particular, whether young, very young or very old. And so what we've seen the past 4 years is not only an attack on the environment, but an attack that has particular impact on people who need the help the most. And today, this evening, I'd like to highlight a few areas where environmental justice issues stick up so prominently. The first I want to talk about, sometimes we talk about climate change, of course, as being so important. But a recent study came out, and this study pointed out that if we implemented the things necessary to protect our climate, we would do tremendous good and by far justify the expense just from the effects of air pollution without looking at climate change at all. The COVID outbreak has underscored the fact that people with pre-existing lung conditions are particularly vulnerable. And what the research shows is people are particularly impacted by air pollution, and particularly those people who live in our urban centers. That pollution comes from things like coal-fired plants. Those of you who've lived in Greenville a long time may remember a few years ago we had a terrific ozone problem here, but that problem has sort of declined, and the reason is a coal-fired plant in Belton retired in 2015, but unfortunately not all of them have been retired. The reduction in auto emissions has made a tremendous positive impact on people. You may remember, some of you are old enough, when lead in the air was a significant issue from autos. But unfortunately, the administration has tried to roll that back. And another illustration of how we have to be concerned about our own government is all of us on this call own coal-fired plants in the form of Santee Cooper in the lower part of the state. A second issue that I've worked a lot on is the issue of toxic waste that is stored near waterways. With increasing hurricanes, with increasing floods, with climate change, and with sea level rise, more and more, those sites are a risk to all of us. The good news is we succeeded in getting coal ash removed from the banks of the Saluda River, right upstream of the drinking water intake for Belton Honeypath, which could have affected so many people there. But the bad news is that people in Sherrill, South Carolina, had a toxic waste area flooded in one of our recent storms, and many of those people lost their homes, which were their principal assets. These sites affect property values as well as health and safety and the clean water on which we all rely. Now, the question might be, what can you do about it? What can we do about it? The first thing I want to emphasize is often people say what you can do in your individual lives. That's important. I mentioned that. I do that. We do that ourselves in our home. But the most important thing is public policy. We're not going to change climate change. We're not going to solve climate change one plastic bag at a time, even though that's important. So public policy and these elections are more important than ever before. The environment is on the ballot. So being involved in elections and public policy at the state, local, and particularly federal level are tremendously important. The second thing is you need to stay active outside of elections. I'd encourage you to join an environmental organization like Upstate Fev or the Sierra Club or the land trust I work with, Natural Land Trust. They keep you informed. And then when you get informed, you have to act. For example, right now in Greenville, we have a land use ordinance on the table with county council. We have a tree ordinance on the table with city council. Our legislature is going to decide in part next year whether Santee Cooper should continue burning coal in communities that have large numbers of people of color and large numbers of poor people living around and near. And should we, by the way, be using diesel buses in Greenville and having that particulate pollution move through our inner city? Or should we instead be moving to more electric buses, as our city and county have recently done? And our legislature next year will be taking up the issue, more of the issues of clean energy, because if there is a way to protect people's health, protect climate change, improve our environment, that is to get more solar energy in our state. What can you do as individuals? Get solar panels on your house if you can possibly afford it. Second, stop using a gasoline mower. Did you know your mower produces more pollution than 43 cars? Get an electric lawnmower. Pay attention to the stormwater in your own yard. And think of your responsibility to your neighbors. That's really what environmental protection is about, having the interests of the entire community at heart. So in this election, the environment's on the ballot and environmental justice is on the ballot. And you can be a warrior for environmental justice. Thank you.
Yes. Teresa Nesbitt Cosby, are you ready to proceed? Are you? Hello?
I'm sorry, I couldn't control the mute button.
Oh, okay. You're still with us. Good.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. And what I want to talk to you about is the erosion of our key pillars of democracy and how that is impacting our current positioning in our American society. So our Republican democracy emanates from a document of ideas and not statutes. One thing is clear, though, that the original organizing document codified racism. Both Native Americans and Blacks are mentioned in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution concerning Congress's power to levy taxes. In counting people in the states, the Constitution included Indians not taxed, while slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person. This officially codified U.S. racism of both Native Americans and Blacks as being inferior and of lesser value than whites. This construction of America as a nation for white people is also evidenced by the history of immigration and naturalization laws that excluded from consideration for citizenship Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans through the Chinese Exclusion Acts, the Japanese Gentleman Agreement, the Asiatic Barred Zone Act, and the fact that Native Americans did not become citizens of the U.S. until 1924 and did not get the full protection of the Bill of Rights until 1968. So when we think about how our nation was built, we must recognize that it starts as an imperfect union where women, minorities, and poor people were not provided the full benefits of liberty and egalitarianism. The scholars Roger Smith and Desmond Howard refer to this as the multiple traditions of America. These multiple traditions are uncovered by studying the impact of American history on the development of the nation. Important for our conversation tonight is how these traditions shaped American institutions and are the organic material that explains what is contributing to the destruction of our governmental institutions, our constitutional protections, and the fracturing of our justice system. And we have examples. Shaundra is going to talk to you about voting. I'm going to talk to you about immigration and the encroaching upon the powers of Congress and the ceding of executive and legislative authority to the courts. So immigration has become a proxy for race. Although Hispanic and Asian are ethnic delineations, over time they have become racialized. The crisis today is shaped by a growing awareness that America is quickly becoming a majority-minority nation. For instance, in 2019, among all 18-year-olds, whites represented 50% of this group. While whites will still be the largest group, they will no longer be the majority. The group most responsible for creating this new reality is Hispanic immigration. Hence, we see a renewed output of racist attacks and attempts by our government to stop the influx of new immigrants into this country, even though economists and demographers will point out to us the benefits of new immigrants. And we see this hostility demonstrated in several ways: children in cages, closing the borders, and stereotypes in which new immigrants are blamed for conditions in America that are not related to their presence in this country. The other threat is Asian immigration, especially immigrants from the Middle East, which is why one of the first acts of the Trump administration was the imposition of a Muslim ban that was blocked by the courts until the executive branch cleaned it up enough that the courts let it slide. And so that's the example for immigration. The other example, and this goes into how our norms in the country are being impacted, is this encroaching or ceding of the powers of Congress by the executive branch. When the framers drafted the Constitution, they spent more time on Article 1 than on any of the other articles in the Constitution. And they delegated to Congress broad and sweeping powers. They actually delegated to Congress 18 enumerated powers. So we're going to examine one particular area as an example of how the power of Congress is being constricted. And that's Congress's power to investigate. The Supreme Court, in a 1927 case called McGreen versus Doherty, established that Congress has the power to inquire and to enforce that power with the ability to punish. That ability to punish is generally via a contempt citation. However, Congress has been thwarted in their attempts to investigate the Trump administration because they depend on the Department of Justice to prosecute its contempt citations. This is an example of a new threat to our democracy, a new erosion of a democratic norm. Although the Justice Department is in the executive branch, generally that department has operated independent of the executive branch in that it is not responsive to commands from the president. Sure, these attorney generals are loyal to the president, but they take the oath seriously to not be under the command of the president. This norm has been eroded today by William Barr, who has operated not as an independent, but as an advocate for the president. His posture impacts and weakens Congress because they cannot compel witnesses to come before them to provide testimony under oath about activities of the executive branch that appear to be highly questionable. Barr's posture expands the power of the executive in ways that the framers did not intend. The president and Barr resting their legitimacy in acting this way on a concept called executive privilege that is not mentioned in the Constitution. The Supreme Court construes executive privilege as an inherent power of the president, but they say that this power is not more powerful than the right of the people to a fair and impartial trial, which is what Barr is threatening today. So Barr, because Barr refuses to aid Congress in seeking truth, his actions are actually expanding the ability of the president to act without constraints that the framers never intended. So now I want to go to a more critical area in which we have about 6 norms that are being violated by the Congress. And this is the ceding of executive and legislative powers to the court. I don't think anyone out there would be surprised if I say Congress is not working. Legislators do not want to alienate their base by supporting unpopular pieces of legislation. And also their leaders aren't pushing them or whipping them to support legislation that address America's needs. They simply don't want to put legislation on the floor that may threaten their majority. So what they will do in place of that is to try to shape the court. And in doing this, they are violating some norms about how we pick our courts. So an example of how legislatures don't want to address pieces of legislation is the Affordable Care Act. This is a piece of legislation that has led an incredible life from highly unpopular to popular. During the height of its unpopularity, Republicans promised to strike this legislation down, and they came one McCain vote short of doing that. But when the bill becomes more popular, they don't want to vote on this bill. Rather, they want the courts to achieve this work for them, to do their job for them. And to accomplish this goal, they need a favorable court. They need to continue to have control of the federal courts and the Supreme Court. And this is where you see this activity around the court. So the first thing they do is implement this manufactured rule that you cannot have a president in his last term of office nominate a Supreme Court justice. So they block President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland. The next norm they violate is in Article 3 has to do with the 60-vote filibuster, which was a tool that the Senate could use to ensure that we didn't get judges appointed to the court who were too ideological or extreme, because if you need 60 votes, you're going to have to appeal to moderates. The other norm that they violated was to change their new rule about no nominations during a presidential election to another new rule that says, oh, we can have a nomination during a presidential election or some mumbo jumbo to justify the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the fill Ruth Bader Ginsburg seat, which is also a highly controversial move. So these are kind of destructions of norms. Another norm that's being destroyed is this norm that legislators should appeal to and represent the will of the public and not non-elected judges to seek endorsement of their policy positions that may be distinct from the public's. Final norm is the destruction of the legitimacy of the court. By politicizing the court, what the threat that the Senate is causing for the court is that when the court makes its judicial policy statements or renders its decision, the public will feel that these are not legitimate decisions because they're politicized. The judges are doing the business of politicians, and hence the public may not support these decisions, which makes them more attackable. The essence are that this is the problem with norms. And we've always had norms that rested on the assumption that the leaders believe in a Republican democracy that we elect, and a democracy that we have carefully crafted and protected for 233 years. But these norms are not enshrined in the Constitution and they're not protected by legislative acts. So when we get someone who does not believe in our values, then we get the situation that we're in today, which are threats to the key pillars of our democracy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I think I was introduced earlier, Shaundra Scott. Thank you so much for having me, and to everyone for joining us tonight for such an important discussion. I'm going to briefly touch on a few key concepts that have become the backdrop of 2020. What are the civil liberties we value in society? Why are those civil liberties such an integral part of the Democratic Party? And what are the threats to our democracy? In our current climate, these concepts would need a panel specifically dedicated to a longer discussion, but we can definitely discuss the top line items. My goal for this presentation is to hopefully introduce a new perspective and inspire our audience to actively participate in our democratic process and show people how to be effective while doing so. There is a list of civil liberties that we value in society, but for the purposes of my presentation, I will touch on the civil liberties that are currently the most pressing as it relates to our democracy. Those civil liberties to me would be voting rights, racial justice, women's rights, criminal justice, LGBTQ, and immigration. There are many more that I feel should be on this list, but these are the issues that are constantly being attacked on a daily basis in our communities and are an integral part of the Democratic Party. In my opinion, I feel that voting rights is the most important civil liberty that we must protect at all costs, especially in this election. Voting is the cornerstone of our democracy and the fundamental right upon which all of our civil liberties rests. Voting allows us to hold politicians accountable for their actions and promises they made when campaigning. This is crucial in today's charged political climate because we, the people, have the power to put a stop to all of the injustices that we have been bombarded with for centuries, and especially in 2020. We have been seeing Black and brown people killed at an alarming rate by law enforcement for years. However, with their invention of smartphones and the speed of social media, we are able to see these images and incidents on what seems like a never-ending loop. There are more hashtags for victims of police shootings than anyone can count, and if we do not act as a collective with a common goal and mission, the hashtags will increase. How do we change this? We can vote to put people in office that care about racial justice and will actively make steps to make a change. We have seen and heard of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Trayvon Martin, Walter Scott, and many more. Walter Scott was from here in South Carolina and was murdered in my hometown in North Charleston, South Carolina in April 2015. Why is this important? The mayor, who has been the mayor since 1994, which is 26 years, has the power to hire the chief of police, who in turn hires and is responsible for training officers that work in our communities. So we must turn out to elect these politicians. Another issue is mass incarceration, and that's a huge issue in America. According to the ACLU, since 1970, our incarcerated population has increased by 700%. 2.3 million people in jail and prison today, far outpacing population growth and crime. One out of every 3 Black boys born today can expect to go to prison in his lifetime, as can 1 of every 6 Latino boys compared to 1 of every 17 white boys. At the same time, women are the fastest growing incarcerated population in the United States. Our prison system costs taxpayers $80 billion a year. We should be reinvesting into our communities to close the wealth and equity gaps and implement more mental health and drug rehabilitation services versus locking people away. Black and brown children are targets of mass incarceration based on their zip code and the school to prison pipeline, which sets children up to be arrested in school, or in the case of Centoya Brown, arrested and charged with murder at 16 years old when she was a victim of sex trafficking and was defending herself against an older man that had solicited to pay her $150 for sex. She was charged as an adult and was sentenced to life. After serving and losing 15 years of her life behind bars, she was finally released in 2019. How could this have been prevented? We need to elect more people into office that will ensure that children are protected in the criminal justice system from sex trafficking and enact laws that provide for fair treatment and application of laws regardless of race. In South Carolina, we can elect the solicitors in 16 judicial circuits. The South Carolina Circuit Solicitor is an elected official who is responsible for overseeing the prosecution of criminal cases in South Carolina. According to the circuit solicitor, they ensure prosecutions are processed by organizing an orderly and efficient flow of cases, assigning cases to attorneys, advising attorneys on the cases assigned, monitoring the status of pending cases, and supervising personnel. Solicitors in South Carolina are elected every 4 years. Out of the 16 South Carolina solicitors that we have today, 2 are men of color and only 1 solicitor is a female. African Americans are arrested for violating marijuana possession laws at nearly 4 times the rate of whites. Yet both ethnicities consume marijuana at roughly the same rates. Specifically, a 2020 analysis by the ACLU concluded Black people are 3.64 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession, notwithstanding comparable usage rates. In every single state, Black people were more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession, and in some states, Black people were up to 6, 8, 10 times more likely to be arrested. In 31 states, racial disparities were actually larger in 2018 than they were in 2010. That's important because the Attorney General argued against that. We need to ensure that our criminal justice system and legislators are reflective of the communities they represent. Not only do we need to vote as minorities and women, we need to run for office. We have been conditioned to think that in order to politician, a judge, solicitor, attorney general, etc., that you have to receive a degree from a certain school, come from a certain and specific type of background, which normally does not include minorities or women, and have access to high-level donors and or cash flow. We see so many people breaking those barriers right now in this election cycle with Adair Burrows, Kim Nelson, Melissa Watson, Mo Brown, and Jamie Harrison, to name a few. South Carolina has not sent a woman to Congress since the Clinton administration. And even more importantly, with the untimely passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, gender equality and women's rights hang in the balance as the current president seeks to nominate and seat a new justice that would affect liberal views for generations to come. This is why we need to vote. We can no longer sit by and think to ourselves that our vote doesn't matter. So many things flow from exercising our right to vote. Voting is more than presidential election. It is about your local election. We need to ensure that our school boards consist of people from the community to fight for our students and teachers. We need to make sure our local city council members and mayors are acting in the best interests of all citizens. We need to hold our senators and our state representatives' feet to the fire when it comes to making sure that the people of South Carolina have adequate resources and access to those resources during situations such as COVID-19, natural disasters, and just maintaining daily life. These civil liberties and many more are an integral part of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party platform includes concepts such as protecting Americans and recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, protecting communities and building trust by reforming our criminal justice system, restoring and strengthening our democracy, renewing American leadership, and healing the soul of America. Education is on the ballot. Immigration is on the ballot. Gender equality is on the ballot. Racial justice is on the ballot. And our lives are on the ballot. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Young. Let me ask a few questions of each of you. Black women have long been considered the backbone of the Democratic Party. Ms. Scott, what, if anything, does Joe Biden's choice for VP Kamala Harris mean to people of color and politics in this country?
I think that's an excellent question. For me personally, as someone that worked on her presidential campaign, I was definitely wanting to be part of history by being a part of a campaign to get only the second Black woman to ever run for president elected. And with this announcement of her as VP, it shows the Democratic Party that that they're taking women seriously and also Black women seriously, and that we are now having a time to have a seat at the table. And so I think that selection has re-energized the Democratic base. It has definitely re-energized Black women. And I think it shows that there's more room for Black women to be in all areas, not just the vice presidential nominee, but in the Supreme Court, as well as cabinet positions and positions across the board.
Well, what are the top two barriers to voting that exist in South Carolina today for women, men, and Black women in particular?
I know some of the barriers are formerly incarcerated individuals. They have the right to re-register to vote as long as they have completed their sentence, they paid their fines, and they've completed any restitution. So that's one barrier. Another barrier would be everything that we have going on now. COVID-19, we were able to fight and expand absentee voting excuse in South Carolina to expand to all registered voters. So all registered voters can vote in person, absentee starting October the 5th, as well as by mail. So that is a huge, huge victory that we were able to achieve, and I'm so excited about that. And as far as other barriers, it would be the fact that election day is on a Tuesday. Most people work and they're not available to be able to get off. Some people work shift jobs, and while the law allows for your employer to let you off for 2 hours to go and vote, that doesn't mean that you're going to get paid. So having this expansion and what we're dubbing as Vote-tober, being able to vote from October the 5th all the way to 11/3 helps to eliminate those barriers.
Thank you. One more question. What is it beyond what you've already discussed that prevents Black women? It seems like Black women, Black men are reluctant to vote. Not only are they hampered, but they seem to be reluctant to vote, and that's been the case for quite some time. Is that a fair observation to make?
Yes, I would say that is a fair observation. From what I understand, and from just being in the community, one of the main themes is that my vote doesn't count, or that this country was not built for me so that I shouldn't participate. And I do feel that is something that has been sown within communities of color, I feel, to prevent us from continuing to seek knowledge and to seek the information that we need to know and understand that our vote does count. And I think with this year, 2020, with this current president that we have in office, the things that we're seeing, COVID has expanded and really and took the lid off a lot of issues that people may not have been paying attention to. Healthcare, for one, definitely not being able to have a job to pay for your mortgage and things of that nature, school, and not being able to have childcare and having to be able to do virtual school, not having access to broadband services, because there are many people who are having difficulty with this whole virtual school thing. So that is something, their assessment, but I do believe that with all of the things that are at our access now, and with all of the issues that are presented, people are really tuning in and paying attention. And we are seeing that with our voter protection team. We have recruited almost 300 attorneys statewide to help with our efforts. We have also recruited almost 1,200 poll watchers, almost 1,500, excuse me, as well as almost 500 hotline workers. So people are in it to win it. They're paying attention. And I don't think this is going to go away. I don't think this is a moment. I think this is a movement.
Thank you. Excuse me. What? Yeah. All right. Let me pull a couple of questions for Teresa Nesbitt Cosby. Are you available?
I'm here.
Okay. What are we are a democratic republic built on the concept of separation of powers. How is this value being threatened today?
Well, other than I'd like to kind of elaborate then on the example I gave earlier with the difference between how attorney generals operated in the past and how attorney generals are operating now. And I'm going to go back to 1973 during the height of the Watergate scandal. And during the scandal, if we recall or read about it, Richard Nixon wanted his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. And Richardson refused to do that, and he immediately resigned his position as Attorney General. Nixon then went to the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, to fire Cox. And he refused, and he also resigned his position as Attorney General. So then Nixon orders Robert Bork, who was the next highest in command, to fire Cox, and Bork does it. But Richardson and Ruckelshaus recognized the role that the Department of Justice played to be the people's attorney and not the president's attorney. And to me, that's a clear parallel to what William Barr is doing, which is destroying the norms of the Department of Justice and the role that they're supposed to play, and which is preventing an accounting of a lot of the activities that have occurred in the Trump administration around the Mueller report and how he reframed that report. And then even the impeachment of the president for his call with the Ukrainian president, where the Congress never really got all of the documents they needed to do a full investigation as to what happened with those calls. And even other things like following the questions surrounding the president's finances. And so that's one of the ways that we see these kind of destructions of these pillars that we're talking about tonight. One of the pillars of justice in our system, at least until now, has been the courts. What role is the court playing in as they approach issues related to those which you've just mentioned, especially those of restraining overreaching by the executive? Well, when you look at the federal courts for the most part have been the institution that has held up, because the justices are independent, Justice Urbina, and you're appointed for life, and so you don't face these political pressures. But that's what the Trump and McConnell are trying to change by pulling the old Adams stacking of the judiciary because of their losing, or their vision that they're losing the legislative and the executive branches of government. And so the courts have been really holding up. There was a report today that all of these kind of voting rights measures of the Trump administration, there have been 90 suits plus suits against the Trump administration over these voting rights restrictions, and they've lost almost all of them in the federal courts. But you see, I mean, it's a split decision, but when you look at what the courts are doing before you get to the Supreme Court, because that becomes something different. When we're looking at the district courts and the courts of appeals, they seem to be holding up and not bowing to political pressure. We'll see what happens with the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court has definitely changed. Could it be the fact that incidentally, there are 27,000 courts on municipal and state level, and there's 1,700, including the Supreme Court justices that operate on that level. But could it be that what's going on is that the U.S. district courts and courts of appeals exercise not discretion, but strict adherence to the law and the cases that govern, while the Supreme Court feels it has more discretion, more latitude in creating a policy right. In the course of its decision making? Right. And justices in the Supreme Court are very fond of talking about how they interpret the Constitution, or what scholars call the modes of constitutional interpretation. And I'm a textualist and I'm an originalist, and all of these different ideological positioning viewpoints that they come from, and they are the court of last resort. Their word is the last word. And so if they want to reshape the law, they can reshape the law. But of course, they are also a constrained court. And so you can keep questions away from the court if you feel you have a hostile court. But that's the court that's really in question more than the courts of appeals, which are larger bodies. And you can have more diversity in the voices on these courts of appeals when cases come before them.
All right. I think we need to turn to the audience. Yes. Mr. Holleman, could you tell us your views on what this concept of environmental justice is? I mean, we hear a lot about it. We know that there are terms that we constantly are exposed to: climate change, air pollution, and so forth. Could you discuss how the connection bears on the concept of environmental justice?
Well, as you might imagine, there's no sort of strict definition of that term, but the general concept is that over time, the kind of government and industry activities that have adverse impacts on the environment in which people live, in the neighborhoods and communities where they live, that those kind of activities have over time been more likely to be placed in lower income communities and communities of color because they had less clout and less political and economic power. And then the other aspect of it is wherever the pollution is coming from, people who are at some kind of disadvantage, it could be political clout, but it could be health, could be income, could be ethnicity, could be geography. They are less able to adapt to the problems, whether it's increased flooding, whether it's poor contaminants in our food or water, whether it's the air you breathe, or the health effects of those things. So the concept is that although environmental contamination pollution affects everyone, it has a particular impact on poor people and people of color and those with less political or economic clout.
Well, speaking of environment and the issues that lie close to us as we look at the environment immediately around us, we live near the Blue Ridge Mountains. How are we doing there?
Well, good news and bad news. A couple of good pieces of news is the coal-fired plant that Duke Energy had operated in Asheville has quit operating. So we no longer have that fog of pollution floating our way. And there've been some great efforts to protect more and more of the mountains and protect that important habitat, which once it's destroyed, may never come back. The bad news is the pressures of development in particular. And if we're not careful, we're going to lose a lot of our most important wild areas because of just the development pressures of developers wanting to develop it so that people can come and buy houses and appropriate it and in effect, unfortunately, damage it. So we've done a good job in protecting important areas up there in the last 30 years, but we've got to do even more to ensure we protect the clean water that flows down from there to all of us and protects those forests, which are the lungs of our region.
How about this issue of natural gas? What is the relevance of natural gas to the issues of climate change and environmental justice? I mean, natural gas specifically.
Well, I always say there's nothing natural about natural gas. It's a substance that's forced out of the ground now, largely through fracking. It has been of help as we've gotten off of coal, but now we're making the leap to renewables, and natural gas, unfortunately, has a tremendous impact on climate change in our air. Because it does generate carbon dioxide when it's burned, but more than that, perhaps even, is the amount of methane that is generated from the ground to your home before it's ever burned, from the ground to the power plant. The goal really is to move everything we can to electricity, and then put online more and more clean electricity, and move as much as we can from natural gas to electric energy.
Ms. Waldrop, do you think that the audience would like to participate now in posing questions to the...
Oh, yes, thank you, Ricardo, and thank you to everybody. I truly appreciate you all being here. My name is Regina Waldrop, and I'll be moderating this portion of our discussion tonight. If you have questions, please put them in a chat. I'll do my best to get to all of them. We have just a little bit of time left, but I know that the panelists and our moderator, Judge Urbina, would love to hear from you. So if you have questions, please put them in as clear a format as you can. I see questions, quite a few coming in now. So I'll start asking the questions. I'd like to ask, if you would, to please put them tell me who the question is for, and I will do my best to get to all of these questions. I would like to go ahead and start with Sherry Mara. And so this appears to be a question perhaps for Judge Urbina and possibly Professor Cosby. Sherry asks, how do we get the DOJ and the Department of Justice, to become more accountable when it goes rogue? So I don't know who we want to start with. Teresa, do you want to take the lead on that? And Ricardo, please feel free to jump in.
I can start the lead. So the challenge for the Department of Justice, as I was saying, it is under the executive branch, and being an executive branch agency, technically, it would be under the control of the president. So the question is, can Congress pass any types of legislation that can change that relationship? And would that violate the Constitution? And so there may not be a legislative remedy. It may more be a responsibility of the voters in who we elect, that we trust that they will return to the norms of how the Department of Justice operates. Judge Urbina, you may have a different opinion.
Well, no, I don't have a different opinion, but I think you've touched on the point of accountability. The people at the Department of Justice, first let me say that my experience with the Department of Justice overall has been a very good one. The line prosecutors do a very good job, and I'd say more than 90% of them are really dedicated and married to the Constitution and try to do the right thing. However, no one can find an environment that is totally free of stress and inappropriate leverage. It seems to me that this president has found the right people who enable him to manipulate the power structure in a way so as to render decisions and outcomes that favor him or favor his agenda. And so I think the best way to get that situation cleaned up is to vote in a new president.
Thank you. We have a question from Kiner Johnson. This might be to Shaundra Scott. There has been recent encouragement of racists to intimidate voters. Have there been any indications that such intimidation is imminent in South Carolina?
I would say the answer to that question is yes. This is the first presidential election where the Republicans are not beholden by a consent decree from 1980s, which would prevent them from engaging in voter suppression and intimidation tactics. So this is the first presidential election where that consent decree was not renewed. And so that is why I believe there's so much panic and fury around what's going on, because there's so many different tactics happening. With our voter protection unit, we are anticipating that. We are making preparations for that, which is why we're trying to recruit as many lawyers as we can to be able to move forward with litigation on the day of election if we need to. And we're also training our poll watchers to be on the lookout for that type of behavior as well. In South Carolina, you have to be 200 feet away from the front of the polling location. And I believe that anyone who wants to engage in any kind of intimidation will be exactly 201 feet away so that they can do whatever they need to do. So we want to encourage our voters to just be vigilant, to stay in line, to not let the presence of those individuals deter them. If they are experiencing that, definitely call our voter protection hotline. We will be running from 6 a.m. in the morning until the last person votes. Hopefully that's not until midnight like it was in the June primary, but we will be there to answer those questions, field those questions to the attorneys. So if you're experiencing any of that, if you're seeing excessive amounts of law enforcement, which is also another intimidation tactic, which goes into racial intimidation as well, please give us a call at our voter protection hotline. But yes, I would expect that, anticipate that, and be prepared.
Okay, thank you. I have another question for Teresa. Can SCOTUS really make law and policy in its decisions? Is it not the purpose of the textualists, for instance, to compare laws and suits to the Constitution and reach decisions within that comparison? This is from Mary McCarthy, and she says, I know there is a difference between the originalists and the textualists, which I understand to me those who are interpreting relative meanings of the Constitution.
So that's kind of, I think it's two questions or two ways to approach it. So let me start with talking about originalists and textualists without being wonky. So originalists are people who try to interpret what was the intent of the framers when they ratified a particular part of the Constitution. And so that requires people to try to get into the framers' heads. A textualist says, I don't really care what they thought. What I care about are what the words meant at the time that the Constitution was ratified. So they don't really get into the thought processes of the framers. And these are just used for the justices who use these modes and other modes of interpretation are saying this will get us to a real constitutional truth so that we stay close to the Constitution and respect the ideals of the Constitution. So that's what the argument is. As far as the court making law, so the contemporary understanding of American people is the court interprets the law and basically says, okay, through our interpretation, this is what the law is. Most scholars will say the court makes law because the court engages in judicial policy decision making. And when they engage in these policy decision making, that becomes the law. And I like to say every time a Supreme Court justice renders an opinion, it's changing that Constitution just a little bit. And that's what makes it a living Constitution. And so yes, I mean, if you think about Brown versus Board of Topeka, did that change the law? And it changed the law monumentally, whereas historians would tell you that Board versus Board of Topeka started the second Reconstruction in America. And that was a decision of the court that was eventually followed by the executive branches and the legislative branches of government. And so I will argue they make law. Other people will argue that they don't make law, but this is why we have good debates about the courts.
Awesome, thank you. We have another question for you, Teresa. It's from India Dennis. What do you think are the best options for the Democrats with the appointment of the new Supreme Court justice? FDR got in trouble for packing the court, and there are other tools that Democrats may be using. Are there other tools that Democrats may be using for greater balance to the court? And Ricardo, I would also suggest if you'd like to jump in on this, but this is to Teresa to start. Thank you.
So there are other threats that the Democrats are making to kind of balance out the court. And one threat is that they will pack the court. So yes, Roosevelt got in trouble for his court packing scheme. And the reason he had his court packing scheme because there were justices who were striking down his New Deal legislation. And so he threatens to pack the court, and the threat goes away when you have the switch in time that saves nine, the old saying. But it was highly unpopular because the public felt that was a manipulation of the court. So if the Democrats have the public on their side, then they may be in a better situation than Roosevelt to pack the court and add maybe 4 justices to change the balance, which is what one of the threats are. The other threat that they're making is to make the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico a state. So if they make the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico a state, you're going to get 4 new senators. And so that's going to give the Democrats 2 more Democratic states so that any future Supreme Court nominees that come up, then the Democratic senators will have more control over those nominations. So those are kind of some of the mechanisms. The Congress always can threaten the court with funding. They can also threaten the court by taking away the court's jurisdiction to hear cases, which actually happened in the case of, after the Supreme Court decided the case of Holleman versus Rumsfeld, who was a Guantanamo detainee who was bin Laden's driver. And Congress didn't like the decision that the Supreme Court made, so they removed the court's jurisdiction to hear these prisoner detainee cases and gave it to the D.C. Court of Appeals. So there are lots of tools that the Congress has, but unfortunately the Senate doesn't really have any ability to stop this the seating of Amy Coney Barrett.
Thank you.
There's one point I would recommend that we keep in mind and perhaps examine going forward. There was a time not too very long ago with another president, actually it's about 20 or 25 years ago, where this whole theory of textualist versus originalist was promoted. And it came to pass that the conservatives got very upset when a textualist or conservative interpretation did not favor the outcome they were looking for. And eventually that whole concept began to erode because judges were saying, well, no, what was originally thought about or what was originally written is this way or that way. And therefore this outcome, albeit an outcome that may not appeal to the more conservative mind, is the one that is correct. So that approach has to be examined in hindsight and in foresight, because if today's theory, which favors a certain outcome, may turn around in a way that will disfavor an outcome in the future when the other side of the aisle becomes actively involved in supporting a particular outcome which is not consistent with either a textualist or an originalist point of view.
Well, if I could just add one example of that would be Gorsuch's decision this last June term in McGirt versus Oklahoma, in which he decided that half of Oklahoma was under Native American control and jurisdiction for criminal law reasons. And that shocked people, but it was a textualist evaluation of the treaties between the Oklahoma Native Americans and the U.S. government.
Right.
Thank you. That was a packed discussion, so we really appreciate that. We have a question for Frank, and I'm actually going to, before I ask you this one question, we'll have two in a row. Amy Sutherland had a question when we were speaking the other day, Frank, for you that I think we really need to get an answer to. Donald Trump has undone and tried to, has just put an attack on our environment and has passed policy and has obliterated policy put into place by the Obama administration. He's selling off natural land. Is there anything that Biden can do to reverse some of those actions? Are there things that are perhaps being thought about now to reverse some of the damage that the Trump administration has done environmentally?
Well, the answer is yes. There's a lot that can be done. In fact, in the environmental world, there is a lot of work being put into now for transition memoranda about what are the regulatory and other issues that can be addressed quickly and are important to address. There's also a statute that for those regulations that were put into place during part of this year, the Congress can repeal those just with one fell swoop. But the agencies can, in general, undo many of these regulations and pull them back. But it's going to take a lot of work. If the regulation or the rollback has actually been put in place, then that has to be undone according to the proper regulatory processes, and that can take time and effort. So a tremendous amount can be done by a new administration to reverse the rollbacks, but it's going to take time and effort, and a new Congress can make a huge impact. Also, I just emphasize, having worked at the Education Department and the Justice Department, who is sitting in those seats of authority makes a huge difference day to day on a whole range of decisions, ranging from budget to enforcement to policy decisions of how regulations are interpreted and enforced. So just having people in office who actually think the Environmental Protection Agency is supposed to protect the environment can make a huge difference. So there's no question these 4 years have done serious and lasting harm, but there's also no question that a new administration, and for that matter, a new Congress, can reverse a lot of it and make a tremendous amount of progress.
So to Shaundra's point, vote. So thank you for that answer. And on follow on is from Lisa Walters. Is there a source, Frank, that you can recommend where we can keep up to date on what's going on locally with the environmental issues we face so that we can speak up on those issues knowledgeably?
Well, what I would do too, if you're talking about very local issues, I would say join Upstate Fever and join the local Sierra Club chapter and get on their email list. And they're going to keep you informed about what's up and what you should be paying attention to. And then if you're talking about sort of more statewide issues and that kind of thing, I'd also, Upstate Fever is helpful on that. And there's also the Conservation Voters of South Carolina, which is is bipartisan, is political. It's nonpartisan. It's purely environmental. But it sends out very good emails about the issues before the legislature. And Upstate Fever and the Sierra Club do that too.
Okay, thank you. And I'll ask one more. I'll come to yours in a second, India. I see your question, but I'm going to ask this question of Frank since we're with Frank at the moment. This is from Carl Young. The question is for Mr. Frank Holleman. What type of effect will the wildfires in California and Oregon have on long-term environmental impact? I think that's such a great question.
Well, they're extremely serious because the intensity and the heat of those fires can alter the environment in those specific places for a long time. And in some ways, they might not even ever recover to the full forest environment they were in the past. Of course, the bigger concern that he may be also referring to is the underlying conditions that cause the fire. And that's really an illustration, I think, at least in part, of the significant impacts of climate change that are going on around us. And the fires themselves, emit a significant amount of carbon into the air and also prevent the forest from acting as a carbon sink. Some amount of fire in forests is natural and is a healthy part of the system. It's just this intense, devastating, unprecedented level of extremes that we see in our climate now, what have to worry us. So those are terrible effects. The main thing is we can have positive effect on everything if we get good policies in place for clean energy and environmental protection.
Thank you so much, Frank. This next question is for Shaundra. Is there any way we can help make sure folks can access witnesses for their ballots if the state changes the regulation on that? Are we considering this or talking about this? And I think, Shaundra.
I was trying to get off of mute.
Thank you.
Yes, so there's been a lot of back and forth in regards to that witness signature requirement. And so what we have been saying and what our message has been is to get the witness signature anyway. We have been, within the last 2 weeks, we have won it in court, and then we got an appeal, and then it had to be stayed, and then we won it again. And so as of this morning, it was appealed again, and it will more than likely go to the Supreme Court. So during all of this time of uncertainty, we from the Voter Protection have been advising people to get the witness signature signed anyway. My fear is that if in fact it is appealed or overturned, that anyone that submitted their absentee ballot without the witness signature requirement could quite possibly be thrown out. And I can very easily see from just the back and forth, like Ms. Teresa said, with over 90 different voting rights lawsuits across the nation. They're actively fighting to suppress voting, make voting much harder. And so if there's a way that they can challenge something, it would be this witness signature requirement. So definitely get the witness signature. There's no issue with actually doing your mail-in ballots. Just get the witness signature requirement. Make sure you're following everything as far as, I know there's like many different envelopes, and you have to make sure you put it in this one and that one. Again, if you have questions, you can always call our voter protection hotline. And I believe scvotes.gov has some step-by-step instructions as well on how to go through your absentee ballot process.
Okay, thank you, Shaundra. And that was also a question from Judy Pandolfi, and I just want to make sure that everybody knows that the voter protection hotline is in our chat, so you can see it there, but it's 855-785-0222. So please call that line if you have any questions along these lines, and that should be helpful to you. I have another question from Kiner Johnson for Judge Urbina. To what extent do the current 8 members of the Supreme Court respect the doctrine of stare decisis? If that's how you pronounce it, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong on that, as it may relate to Roe versus Wade.
Stare decisis is the way that a lot of people pronounce it. And I would not venture to do a strict breakdown as to the 8 now existing members of the court. Stare decisis simply means that the precedent that addresses the issue is the one that governs. That court, a court has to follow the precedent that's been established. Now, as I said, the Supreme Court is different in many ways than other courts. For example, trial courts, the court I was on for so many years, is focused on facts. Trial judges don't have a lot of latitude to invent policy or to do things that are outside the framework of the cases and the laws that exist. There's always some room for interpretation, no question about it. But generally speaking, the courts, the trial courts, and even the appellate courts to a certain extent follow what's been said about the particular subject matter before. The Supreme Court is different because, well, let me give you an example. There was no stare decisis when Brown versus the Board of Education was promoted. There was nothing that directed the court to do so. In fact, the court strayed from prior practice by interpreting psychiatric and psychological and sociological information that then impelled the court, I say impelled the members of the court at that time, to decide the matter in a certain way so that separate but equal was no longer acceptable. But there was no stare decisis, so to speak, that guided or compelled an outcome. So What we're talking about is something that has let me put it this way. We think of the law as the black letter law, and that's what stare decisis and precedent directs the attention of the lawyers to look at it and the judges to look at. However, what we fail to recognize sometimes is that the black letter law has spaces in between the lines. That those spaces signify the ability to seek fairness, to construct fairness out of what's presented by way of the black letter law. Some courts do it in equity, some courts do it, but that equity and other concepts of fairness integrate and become activated when the court is faced with a decision that may not be exactly on all fours with another case, stare decisis. So how the Supreme Court is going to react, I've never sat in, I've sat on the Court of Appeals once or twice by invitation, but the fact of the matter is I've never sat in on a session at the Supreme Court. We all speculate as to how that goes, how the case is assigned for writing the opinion, what influences those justices to influence each other on an outcome. So I wouldn't dare to try to speculate on how each one of those is going to interpret stare decisis. I'll say this: the rule of law is what every judge, every justice is supposed to be following, because without adhering to the rule of law, and in this instance, precedent, stare decisis, decisions would be all over the place. Thank God for the trial courts. Thank God for the U.S. district courts that try cases, because they're the ones that usually adhere to the decision-making precedents that rule. But if the court, Roe v. Wade, for example, there are arguments that are going to be made, as they have already been made and will be made again, that terminating a pregnancy is tantamount to murder. And they're going to push that point emotionally, technically, and in every other way that's going to arouse the attention and the opinion of people who reason it to that point and then stop. There are Roe v. Wade. If the question is it possible that Roe v. Wade will be reversed? Yes, it is possible. Is it probable? I'd say there may be some parts of Roe v. Wade, the impact of Roe v. Wade and the outcomes of Roe v. Wade that may be cut back rather than totally undone. But I'm guessing along with everybody else. I'd love to hear somebody else's opinion on this.
Teresa, you're welcome if you want to take a moment on that. We have one more question after this. I think we just have just a quick 30 seconds if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, Roe v. Wade is kind of being used now as kind of a cover for what the Senate is doing in its nominations. And the judges that are being appointed now are judges who have leaned towards overturning Roe versus Wade. But there are two kind of theories in line with Judge Urbina, that the court will accept an argument of fetal personhood. And if they accept an argument of fetal personhood, then they will have to determine the privacy interest of the woman against the life and interest of the fetus. And if you remember, or if you recall, the original analysis in Roe versus Wade was that the only harm that was being caused was the harm to the woman in being forced to carry an unwanted pregnancy. But if you accept fetal personhood, then the court says, well, now there are two interests, and which interest will carry the day? Would it be the life and being or the privacy interest of the woman? So if they accept this fetal personhood argument, then they would necessarily have to overturn Roe versus Wade. And so that's one theory. The other theory is that the court will continue a death by 1,000 cuts approach to Roe versus Wade, which is to continue to limit the availability of an abortion to those people who are seeking the abortion by allowing state restrictions that have been historically struck down, such as hospital privileges, requirements, and any kind of machination you can come up with because states have come up with some very imaginative things, like South Carolina, the woman has to look at the ultrasound, but that the court will continue to allow those restrictions to survive Justice O'Connor's undue burden standard. And then you have abortion on paper, but not abortion in fact, as available to women.
Thank you. I know that's a robust discussion, and we could spend all night just talking about that. I think that's a lot, and I really appreciate that feedback. One more question, and then we'll close our meeting. This is from Diego Alvarez. Given the present circumstances with Trump acting like a fascist dictator, do you have the constitutional concept of checks and balances? Do we believe that the constitutional concept of checks and balances has any meaning in our time? And I will turn that over to Judge Urbina to respond to, and then you can bring us to a close if you don't mind. Thank you so much, everybody.
Well, Diego Alvarez is a friend of mine, and I know how he thinks about this topic. And I can't say that I disagree with the anger and ire that he has as a result of how the system has been manipulated. But would you repeat the latter part of the question? Maybe I can narrow.
Yes, it's basically with Trump acting like a fascist, do we believe that the constitutional concept of checks and balances has any merit now?
The constitutional concept of checks and balances does have merit. It, like other parts of the whole fabric, the whole matrix of ruling by a democracy or a democratic republic, it's fragile and it's vulnerable. And if you have a person who is focused on the fragility and the vulnerability of a concept and has the resources to explore and exploit the fragility of something legitimate, then you have the very real possibility that the checks and balances system is not always going to work. My belief is that it will work, that it will regenerate, and that the exposure that will be needed vis-a-vis not only Congress and courts, but the exposure that is needed vis-a-vis the media will begin to saturate the thinking of those who want to know more about whether or not they can expect a just cause, a just outcome as a result of what we believe or what the system believes or what the system touts as checks and balances. I do believe checks and balances are there, but I do believe that because it's a vulnerable and fragile concept, that it can be overlooked, it can be mutilated, and it can be turned aside, but always temporarily.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the panel. And I would like to say how much I appreciate everybody's time in pulling this together. This is the inaugural Equal Justice Forum. Our hope is to have more of these in the future. It's been a challenge with the pandemic to pull this together. I really applaud everybody for adjusting to this forum. It will be so nice when we can get together in person again. Eli, I see you joined us. If you'd like to say a few words to close us out, that would just be wonderful. Thank you.
I could also add a couple of words, just one sentence.
Thank you. Yes, Ricardo, if you would go ahead and take the lead on that, that would be great.
I was, in reading some things that I thought might be relevant, I came across a quote by Sharon Salzberg, who is one of our most outstanding contemporary thinkers. And she wrote as follows: voting is the expression of our commitment to ourselves, to one another, to this country, and to the world.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you first to our team at GCDP, Regina, for your leadership in the fundraising committee. Thank you for the panelists, Professor Cosby, Dr. Cosby, thank you so much. Frank, it is so wonderful to always see you and you bringing your knowledge. My dear friend, Shaundra, just so brilliant and so passionate, just so excited. And obviously our moderator, Ricardo. We have to mobilize ourselves. We need to mobilize our family. We need to take our friends to the poll. Let's make a movement. Vote this whole month. And then after you vote, sign up to Poll Watch. Protect someone else's vote. We have freedoms because people fought for us. We have to pass on those freedoms by fighting for the next person behind us. We have a great campaign that is really taken off, and it's our 2020 campaign. We're asking folks to do recurring donations at the $20.20 level to help build this infrastructure, to continue to see programs and discussions just like this. So it is my pleasure to sign off. Thank you so much for all of you attendees that joined and stayed on, and our brilliant panelists. Democratically yours, as we like to say. Let's do this thing and elect.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye,
Have a
y'all.
good night.
Night.
Bye.